Welcome back, Seekers of Wisdom. Today marks day 29 of our 30-day Wisdom Quest Challenge. We are no longer just travelers on a trail. We are architects of inner transformation. The path behind us is long and winding, carved through the dense forests of doubt, across the deserts of discomfort, along rivers of reflection, and up steep ridges of revelation. We've yet tasted the wind at high altitudes and felt the mud pull at our feet in the valleys. We've stood beneath the stars, wondering, and sat beneath the weight of our own shadow, questioning. And now, with one more step before the summit, we pause not to rest, but to listen. This is the moment before the crescendo, the stillness before the final drumbeat. We are not here to end. We are here to gather, to integrate, to define. The work ahead is not one of expansion, but of distillation. The world offers infinite paths, but the wise do not walk all of them. They choose, they carve one. And that carving begins today with your Credo. This is not a mere journal entry. This is not a casual reflection. This is the culmination of a sacred journey, the conscious crafting of a personal philosophy forged through fire, failure, forgiveness, and fierce honesty. Synthesis is not convenience. It is confrontation. It demands that you look at all that you've unearthed and ask, what do I stand for now? You are not just a witness to change, you are the sculptor of it. This is not the passive summary of what we've learned. This is the active, deliberate creation of what we choose to carry forward. Your Credo is not a review. It is a vow. It is the spine that holds up the body of your days. It is the lighthouse you build from the wreckage and treasures of your past. And when the world gets loud again, when distraction returns, when fear claws at the door, your Credo will whisper back the words you chiseled in clarity. Think of it this way. The soul is a sculpture buried in stone. All your life, you've been handed chisels, some useful, some dull. You've made careless cuts and precise incisions. You've broken pieces you wish you hadn't. But now, for the first time, you get to carve not out of survival, but out of truth. Over the last 28 days, you've collected not just insights, but instruments. You've excavated the hidden architecture of your mind, softened the scar tissue around your heart, redefined success, confronted mortality, explored your values, and glimpsed what legacy means in both private and public life. You've walked through the spiritual equivalent of seasons, and now you must decide what remains evergreen, what cannot be compromised, what deserves your name etched beside it. A Credo is not a slogan. It's not meant for Instagram. It's not meant to sell or persuade. It's meant to anchor. It's meant to be a private cathedral of conviction that you return to when storms rise. It's a sword and a shelter, a threshold and a mirror. Today, you are called not to react to life, but to define how you will respond to it. Not to echo the wisdom of others, but to carve your own voice from silence. And so, let us return once more to the city of Kairos. We walk the dusk-lit streets, past candlelit doorways and statues that shimmer in the fading light. The wall of names stands in the distance, glowing like a horizon of memory. But today, we do not walk toward it. Instead, we descend down a quieter path into the past. Not just Kairos's past, but the origin story of the one who would someday leave behind the greatest Credo ever carved. Before he was a master, Elias was an echo. He was a young man shaped by reverence, not yet by originality. His hands were skilled beyond his years, able to replicate the classics, to imitate the sacred proportions, to mimic the breath of gods in stone. But imitation is not yet truth. And Elias knew, though he never said it aloud, that something essential was missing. That perfection without purpose is a hollow triumph. He felt it in the quiet hours, when the studio was still, and the only sound was his heartbeat echoing against marble walls. He felt it in the envy that bloomed when others carved from the soul, and he could only carve from memory. He longed not just to create, but to declare. Not just to sculpt, but to mean. His teacher, Master Lyra, had seen this crisis before, the paralysis of potential, the ache of unrealized voice. She knew that no apprentice ever became an artist until they risked themselves wholly, vulnerably, irreversibly in their work. And so, one late afternoon, she summoned Elias. The light in the sky was that strange golden blue when the day doesn't end, but transforms. She led him past the familiar halls into a chamber he had never entered, her private studio, the inner sanctum, the place of unfinished thoughts. There were no masterpieces there, only beginnings, stones partially shaped, statues half-birthed, ideas fossilized mid-flight. It was not a hall of fame, it was a shrine to the unknown. In the center stood a single pedestal. Upon it, a block of marble unlike any he'd ever seen. White, luminous, and impossibly quiet. "This," Lyra said, "is your final test." Elias bowed slightly, unsure. "What am I to carve?" "A credo," she replied. "Not for the city, not for the temple, for you." He blinked. "My beliefs?" "Yes," she said. "Not the ones you inherited, not the ones you admire, the ones you choose, the ones you bleed for, the ones you'll return to when all else crumbles." Elias stepped forward. He felt something tighten in his chest, not fear exactly, but exposure. He was being asked not to prove his skill, but his soul. "How do I begin?" he whispered. She didn't answer at first. She let the silence stretch like a drumbeat between them. Then she said, with the 3 questions of the chisel. The first question, "What have you learned from the dust?" She handed him a block of leadstone, rough, heavy, unfinished. It was dense in weight and memory. It was the stone no sculptor asked for, and few dared to touch. Elias took it with both hands and staggered slightly, not because of its mass alone, but because of what it represented. "This," she said, with a voice carved from centuries of discipline, "is your memory of failure, the grit of effort, the pain of falling short. Begin there. Begin where the pride fell away and only truth remained." Elias bowed his head as if the stone itself had spoken. He pressed his palm to its jagged side, letting its uneven edges bite into his skin. And then he closed his eyes. The studio, the light, the presence of his teacher all dissolved. He was no longer an apprentice standing in Lyra's sanctum. He was a boy again, a young man again, a soul suspended in a sea of forgotten attempts. The darkness behind his eyelids was not empty, it was crowded. Crowded with the echoes of failures long buried, some recent, some ancient, all waiting to be seen. He remembered the sculpture that cracked, not just from a misstep in pressure, but from a moment of arrogance, the refusal to pause, to breathe, to humble himself before the stone. He saw himself as a young apprentice, too eager to prove, and not yet willing to learn. He remembered the sharp sting of a master's silence when he presented work that was precise but hollow. He felt again the chill of the studio after a client dismissed months of work with a single phrase, technically brilliant, but lifeless. That comment had echoed through him longer than he admitted, because deep down, he feared it was true. He remembered a rival praised not for depth, but for flair, for spectacle, for daring to be visible. He had stood in the back of that hall, hands clenched, wondering if honesty had any place in a world that rewarded charm. He recalled the first time he questioned whether he belonged in the craft at all. It was not a dramatic moment, but a quiet one. A day he could not lift the chisel. A day when everything he touched felt wrong. He remembered how he wandered the edge of the city that night, unsure whether to return. He stood beneath a cold sky, asking it silently if it had made a mistake in calling him to this path. There were the humiliations that hurt loudly and those that hurt quietly. The time he lost a commission because he refused to flatter. The moment an elder told him, "You have talent, but no voice." He remembered hiding unfinished pieces in corners, too ashamed to even discard them. They sat like ghosts behind curtains, whispering his doubt back to him every morning. He remembered the betrayal, how a fellow apprentice took his design, presented it as their own, and received praise. Elias had frozen. He said nothing, not out of grace, but paralysis. In that silence, he learned that fear can be as loud as anger, and that self-abandonment often looks like keeping the peace. There were the small lies he told himself. I'll start tomorrow. This piece isn't ready yet. I need more time to think. But beneath every excuse was a fear not of the chisel, but of what it might reveal. He remembered sculpting for admiration, not for meaning. He remembered polishing pieces he no longer believed in because they were safe. He recalled the hollow applause after showcasing a work designed to impress, not to express. The world clapped and he smiled, but inside he grieved for the honesty he'd buried in marble. He remembered the moments no one saw, the late nights where he stood over a half-finished sculpture and whispered apologies to it. The morning he stared at his reflection in a bowl of water, asking himself, who are you doing this for? There were days he avoided the studio altogether, not because he was tired, but because he was afraid of facing the work, afraid of facing himself. He remembered the lies he told to peers to appear productive, the way he exaggerated his progress, laughed too loudly, deflected too quickly. All masks. He remembered watching his own hand hesitate over stone, not from lack of skill, but from a terrifying sense that he might never be enough. And even worse, that if he was finally seen for who he really was, not the prodigy, not the perfectionist, but the seeker, the struggler, it might all fall apart. Then came the deeper truths, buried beneath pride and performance. The times he adjusted his convictions to please. The times he said yes when his soul screamed no. The moments he thought, if I can just make this perfect, maybe they'll love me. He remembered the moment he realized that excellence had become a currency to buy affection, and it was bankrupting him. He remembered the long stretch of days where he did not touch the chisel at all, where he felt empty, directionless. A sculptor in name, but not in practice. Those were not the darkest times because of absence, but because of disconnection from his calling, his courage, his center. What do these moments teach you? Lyra's voice pierced the haze. Elias opened his eyes, but he did not look at her. He looked at the stone. That control is an illusion, he said. That resilience is forged in friction. That craft is corrupted by comparison. That pain is a syllabus the ego fears, but the soul requires. That every stumble is a syllable in the language of growth. That silence can be cowardice, not wisdom. That dignity does not lie in never falling, but in rising without resentment. That the sculptor who fears mistakes will never meet the stone honestly. That the dust is not a byproduct, it is a proof of engagement. And with that, he carved not in haste, not for show, but with the gravity of a vow. The lidstone welcomed the cut, as if it had been waiting for his truth. My peace is found in my response, not in the perfection of the world. I walk my path. I do not measure its worth by the footsteps of others. Pain refines. Shame reveals. I do not turn from them. Every failure is an unfinished sculpture containing wisdom. I will not resent the chisel that shaped me. The dust speaks more truth than applause. Forgiveness of self is the first cut of healing. Betrayal may steal the moment, but not the meaning. Even forgotten efforts echo within the stone. To be broken is not to be ruined, it is to be opened. Disappointment is the doorway through which honesty enters. I will not confuse stillness with fear, nor movement with progress. I will meet shame with curiosity and regret with redirection. The failure I fear may contain the lesson I lack. I do not sculpt to escape error, I sculpt to grow through it. I do not chase perfection, I seek precision in presence. I welcome the scar, for it teaches me where I once hid. I will not flinch from my unfinished self. Dust on my hands means I tried. The studio of failure is where wisdom first sets its roots. Days turned into nights. The light shifted, and so did Elias. He sat beside the leadstone for hours, for days, listening. Listening not with his ears, but with his memory, with his honesty, with his longing to be whole. He swept the dust not as a chore, but as a ritual. He touched it gently, let it coat his fingertips, and finally understood. The dust was not the residue of failure. It was the language of becoming. The stone that once felt like burden now stood like a companion. Its roughness no longer intimidated, it reassured. He had not mastered the stone, he had joined it. And as the final line was carved, and the dust settled around his ankles, Elias felt something shift within him. Not completion, but clarity, not arrival, but readiness. The dust did not sting. It no longer whispered shame. It spoke only truth. And for the first time in his life, Elias bowed not to a master, not to an audience, but to the sacred difficulty of the path itself. The second question, what makes the stone sing? Lyra returned, this time carrying a very different kind of stone, smaller than the last, but impossibly smooth, as if it had been softened not by tool or polish, but by centuries of light. It held no obvious flaw, but glowed with a quiet clarity, as if moonlight had been poured into its core. She placed it on the pedestal before Elias with reverence, almost as though it were alive. This, she said, with a softness that commanded more silence than a shout, is the stone of joy. Remember, Elias reached out. His fingertips met its surface, and something in his memory unlocked. Where the last block had pulled forth grief and failure like a rising tide, this stone did something gentler. It invited him to return, not to wounds, but to warmth, not to regret, but to reverence. At first, he remembered the obvious joys, the moments when the world fell away and he was utterly present. The mornings in his studio before the sun rose, when silence filled the room like incense. No expectations, no audience, just him, the chisel, and the stone. In those sacred hours, he wasn't trying to create anything spectacular. He was simply listening. It was then he realized joy was not something he added to his work. It was what emerged when nothing was missing. He saw again the small sculpture he carved for his mother, of a bird resting on an open hand. It wasn't technically perfect, but when she received it, she cried, "You made this with more than your hands," she said. That memory was more precious than any award he'd ever won. He remembered giving her that gift, not to impress, but to express. That was what made the difference. He recalled the day when, while sculpting wings from marble, a bird landed on his studio windowsill. The creature stood still, head tilted, watching. Elias had paused. For that one moment, it felt as if nature itself was in conversation with his craft. The air was filled with something indescribable, as though the stone and the bird recognized one another through him. Joy flickered not from ego, but from harmony. And then came memories, layered in even quieter joy. The lantern he lit for a fellow apprentice without being asked. The tools he sharpened before anyone else arrived. The time he swept the floor after everyone left, not for praise, but because it was the right thing to do. Those gestures asked for no recognition, but they left something behind, an invisible warmth, a thread woven into the atmosphere. That was joy too. He remembered watching someone pause before one of his public sculptures, an elderly man who, thinking he was alone, bowed his head before it and whispered something only he could hear. Elias had been across the square, unknown to the man, watching from a bench. That moment, more than any public unveiling, reminded him why he carved at all. Art, real art, was not about being celebrated. It was about creating something worthy of someone's silent gratitude. He saw again the candlelight glinting on the marble late one night, when he was so immersed in carving that hours passed without notice. His breath, his heartbeat, His hands all moved in rhythm. He had disappeared into the work. Not vanished, but become part of something larger. That was joy. Not escape, but unity. He remembered the tears in a stranger's eyes as they stood before a sculpture he almost didn't finish. He remembered the quiet prayer he found himself whispering, not to any god, but to the act itself, when he paused to admire a line that had emerged so naturally it felt like grace. He remembered touching the cool stone in the morning and thinking, "You are not mine, I am yours." And then there were the more elusive moments. Times when he saw beauty in the curve of a shadow on the floor, or the hush of snow outside the studio window. Joy in the way his hands hurt after hours of effort, because that pain meant he had given himself fully. Joy in the way Lyra sometimes watched him work, not saying a word, but smiling faintly, like someone witnessing a secret being revealed. He remembered the first time he worked not for a client, not for a teacher, not for himself, but simply because he had to. Not because of duty, but because he was pulled toward the stone by something deeper than desire, a sense that this act was sacred, and he was its vessel. He recalled the sensation of wonder, the thrill of not knowing exactly what would emerge, but trusting the process anyway. He remembered how joy had often arrived when he wasn't looking for it, in laughter during a break in the shimmer of dust, caught in a beam of light in the quiet company of someone who needed no explanation. Lyra's voice, soft but piercing, broke the reverie. What lives beneath these moments? Elias did not answer quickly. He let the silence do its work. Then, quietly, he spoke. Presence, belonging, devotion, connection, service, stillness, humility, wonder, reverence, grace. And so he carved not hurriedly, but with full attention. Each engraving was a distilled truth. Excellence is the act of loving the process. My work matters most when it touches another's heart. I am not alone in my solitude. I belong to the silent chorus. Joy comes not from being seen, but from seeing clearly. The stone sings when I forget myself and remember beauty. I craft best when I vanish inside the doing. The echo of joy is the sound of alignment. Gratitude is the music beneath effort. The sacred is found in unnoticed care. Real joy is not loud, it is quietly complete. When my hands serve without ego, the stone responds with song. Joy is the light that arises when love meets labor. Wonder is the breath between thoughts. Every act of care creates invisible music. In joy, I find the shape of my soul. Stillness is not absence of action, but the presence of peace. I create not to be remembered, but to remember. Joy is not a reward, it is the revelation of alignment. In the rhythm of simplicity, I find wholeness. True beauty needs no audience. With each engraving, he did not just capture a belief, he excavated it. These weren't pretty thoughts. They were earned. They were sweat-soaked, dusk-lit, whispered over years of practice. And with each line, the luminous stone seemed to respond. The light within it pulsed, as though recognizing its own name. Elias realized that joy was not an accessory to life, it was a tuning fork. It resonated when he was aligned with what mattered. It was not the applause at the end, but the hum during the making. Joy did not arrive to congratulate, it arrived to affirm. It said, "Yes, this is you. Keep going." He began to see joy not as the opposite of pain, but as its companion, both pulling him deeper into truth. One refined, the other revealed. One carved, the other sang. When the last word was carved and the dust settled, Elias looked at the stone, then at his own hands. They were rough, covered in powder and time, but he felt no fatigue, only stillness, only wholeness. The studio around him blurred. The past and present mingled. There was only this moment, this truth, this echo of harmony between hand, heart, and stone. And in that moment, the stone sang. It did not use words. It needed none. Its music was the silence between heartbeats, the quiet between thoughts. It was the song of a life briefly aligned with the eternal. And Elias, listening, wept not out of sadness, but because he recognized the sound. It was the sound of home. The third question: for whom do you carve? Lyra entered the room once more, but this time she brought nothing. No block of marble, no slab of wood, not even a lump of clay. Her hands were empty, and so was the pedestal before Elias. The silence between them stretched longer than before, expectant, deliberate. Finally, she spoke. "This question," she said, her voice hushed but unyielding, "must be answered without hands." At first, Elias did not move. He stood in front of the vacant pedestal, feeling its blankness press inward like a mirror to his own uncertainty. There was nothing to touch, nothing to mold, no place to direct his skill. And yet, deep within, he felt the shape of the answer beginning to rise, not in his fingers, but in his memory. He remembered the long arc of his early ambitions, how they were shaped less by devotion and more by hunger. Hunger for validation, for admiration, for success as defined by those who whispered the rules of the game from behind velvet ropes. He remembered the years when every stroke of the chisel had a hidden audience, when he sculpted not to tell a story, but to secure a commission, when he shaped stone not to liberate beauty, but to gain approval. He remembered the way his work began to mirror the desires of others, not the vision that stirred quietly within him. How, over time, his voice was muffled beneath layers of expectation until he couldn't hear it at all. He recalled moments of applause that landed hollow, like rain on stone. He remembered the dread that followed a well-received unveiling, dread that the next work would not measure up, dread that his value might vanish with a single misstep. He remembered polishing pieces long past necessity, not because the stone required it, but because he did not to elevate the work, but to disguise his doubt. And perhaps most bitterly, he remembered the quiet betrayal of his own instincts, the times he muted them, reshaped them, buried them to appease someone else's aesthetic, someone else's version of what was worthy. "I used to carve for glory," he said finally, his voice weighted with memory. "I carved for praise, for reputation, for the seat at the table where the powerful spoke and the rich nodded. I carved to be included, to be admired, to be accepted." He took a breath, and the studio seemed to listen. "But now," he continued, "I carve for something else. I carve for truth, for the raw, unpolished center of what it means to be human. I carve for those who come after me, who may never know my name, but who will run their hands along the lines I leave behind. I carve for the child I once was, desperate for a sign that something honest still existed in the world. I carve for the wanderers, the quiet souls who search for beauty without knowing they are searching. I carve for those who are told they don't matter, who need something real to anchor them when the world feels false. I carve for the unseen witness, for the spirit of integrity that watches even when no eyes are present." His gaze softened, memory returning not just as thought, but as feeling. "I carve for those who will never meet me, but who might feel, for a brief and sacred moment, that they are less alone because of what I made. I carve for the invisible, the unheard, the overlooked. I carve for the lineage of hands that shaped stone long before mine, and for the hands that will take it up long after I'm gone. I carve for the stories that never made it into history, for the truths buried in silence. I carve to give form to principles that would otherwise dissolve in noise. I carve not because I seek recognition, but because something within must be spoken and stone listens." He thought of faces, real ones. The elderly woman who once touched one of his sculptures and wept openly, whispering to it like a ghost from her past had returned. The orphaned child who sat beside a statue every day after school, tracing its base with tiny fingers, saying nothing but refusing to leave. The blind man who wrote to him, describing the way his fingertips could hear the truth in the carving better than sight ever could. The refugee child who touched a marble angel and said only, "I believe again." The teacher who brought her students to a plaza where his statue stood, using silence as a space for empathy. These were the ones, not the gallery owners, not the critics, not the patrons. These were the ones who made the work matter. He thought of the difference between fame and impact, between admiration and resonance, between success and meaning. And as he stood there in the presence of the question, his heart offered the only answer it could. I carve not to be praised, but to bear witness. I carve to carry what words cannot. I carve for the broken, the seekers, the still beating hearts buried beneath armor. I carve to preserve what is sacred and unspoken. I carve so someone else might find themselves reflected in the shape of stone and feel, even briefly, that they matter. Then came the real test. A nobleman arrived bearing a commission. It was extravagant, prestigious. The request, a grand statue of the nobleman himself, clothed in the armor of myth, hand raised in false heroism, etched with fabricated victories. Elias read the proposal and felt the familiar tug of temptation. The fee was more than generous. The offer included public acclaim, safety, status, political favor, a future of ease, a throne carved from compromise, but beneath the gold was ash. The nobleman didn't want truth. He wanted a monument to ego. Elias knew this would be the most visible piece of his career. But it would be a lie chiseled into stone, fixed in public memory, hollow at its core. He refused. It was not a dramatic moment, no shouting, no storm, but the refusal came from a place deeper than pride. It came from allegiance to the work, to the craft, to something incorruptible. He let the offer fall like a dull coin to the floor. He turned toward poverty rather than away from principle. It was not easy, but it was clear. He remembered then, not in bitterness, but in truth, the lines he had etched into his own code. I will not trade truth for reward. My work loses meaning if I sell my soul. If my hand bends for profit, my soul will fracture. To carve a lie, no matter how grand, is to betray the stone. My convictions must weigh more than gold. I am not the voice of power, but of conscience. Integrity is earned by the choices no one applauds. The path of truth is narrow, but it is strong. I will not be a sculptor of illusions. I choose quiet courage over loud compromise. The world may forget the honest craftsman, but the work will remember. A lie carved in marble still crumbles in time. The hands that shape dishonesty become calloused with regret. True art bears the fingerprints of courage. I would rather starve with honor than feast with shame. Lyra said nothing. She didn't need to. In her silence was a kind of affirmation one, deeper than words. He had passed, but not because he had answered correctly. He had passed because he had remembered who he was. His refusal was not an act of defiance. It was a return to the vow that lives beneath all creation, to shape with truth, to serve with humility, and to carve not from fear, but from faith. The pedestal remained empty, but something immense had been shaped in its place. Elias understood then that the greatest sculptures are often invisible. They do not sit in squares or halls. They live in the choices we make when no one is watching, in the promises we keep in silence, in the courage it takes to turn down a crown in favor of a compass. And in that moment, the space between him and the stone vanished. Because he was the sculpture now carved, not from marble, but from memory, conviction, and the quiet resilience of integrity. Years unfolded like petals in the life of Elias, the sculptor who had long since surrendered the pursuit of acclaim. He aged not as some wither, but as stone weathers deeper, more textured, more resonant. His hands, calloused and worn, carried both memory and insight. They moved not with urgency, but with understanding, as if each gesture was a prayer offered to time itself. He no longer carved for money, nor for recognition. Those seasons had passed like forgotten winds. He carved now for something elemental, something incorruptible. His works were no longer made for display, but for discernment. Each piece was a meditation rendered in form, a silent dialogue between the soul and the world. His studio, once a space for commissions and deadlines, had transformed into a sanctuary of stillness. It became less a place of production and more a temple of inner excavation. The clang of his chisel rang like a monastery bell, echoing through the bones of the building, inviting all who heard it into reflection. Visitors who once came seeking art began arriving seeking presence. His bench, long stripped of business ledgers and patron scrolls, now bore only tools worn smooth by used bits of parchment with unfinished thoughts, a cup of cooling tea, and sometimes a feather or a stone left behind by someone moved beyond words. The dust that gathered in corners was not swept away as waste, but brushed gently aside like sacred ash remains of revelation. Each particle was a witness to hours of contemplation, each speck a testament to the discipline of returning, again and again, to what mattered. In that quiet sanctum, he no longer sought to shape stone, but to be shaped by it. Apprentices came, some full of fire, some of fear. They traveled from distant lands, drawn not by fame, but by the invisible current of something true. They came because the world had left them disoriented, starved of sincerity, weary of hollow excellence. Some remained for years, learning to abandon perfection in favor of truth. They realized that chiseling stone was only the surface of the work. The deeper labor was the chiseling away of pride, fear, and falsehood. Some, like gentle Serin, found their voice not in words, but in the careful language of craft. She learned to speak through stone what her lips could never say. Others, like brash Levin, recoiled at the nakedness demanded by honesty. They fled, unsettled by the quiet invitation to drop pretense. Still others returned years later, their edges softened by life, ready at last to begin again. They no longer came to be taught, they came to remember. Elias welcomed them all with equal stillness. He did not judge who stayed or who ran. He knew that readiness was not a virtue, but a timing. He saw no shame in delay. The Credo, he said often, is not a display piece, it is a practice. And not every hand can carve its truth before the soul is ready. Hesitation did not disturb him. Silence did not make him impatient. He understood the importance of waiting. The delay before a strike is as vital as the strike itself. In every apprentice, he saw not their performance, but their possibility. His gaze was like the gaze of stone, unmoving, unblinking, but profoundly present. Even as he mentored others, Elias remained a student of the stone. He revised his own Credo stone not once, not twice, but 4 times. Not out of doubt, but out of evolution. Each revision was not a correction, but a confirmation that he had become someone new. Grief had etched new lines into his spirit. Joy had softened once rigid edges. Doubt had refined his courage into something quieter and more enduring. His later inscriptions carried the echo of sorrow and the warmth of peace. He allowed love to leave marks deeper than any wound, and pain to become the finer blade. The final inscriptions he carved were not announcements, but whispers. Grace is more enduring than pride. Legacy is the courage to begin again. A credo must be lived, not displayed. Every day I chisel again. A single true stroke outweighs 1,000 hollow flourishes. Let my final act be the echo of my first belief.